Okay, good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Robert Moszkowicz. In fact, it should not be very difficult because I guess that most of you know Robert very well. He has been a member of the Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris since 1980.
It's very long time here.
Robert is an expert in the physics of compact objects and of the explosive events which are associated to these objects. He worked on many topics, especially on the interior of white dwarfs and the difficult theoretical question of their cooling and related to the question of the luminosity function of white dwarfs in the galaxy. He has worked on the physics of core collapse supernovae, and especially on, he already had the chance to have a very important event at the beginning of his career with the supernova 1987A in the Large Magellanic Cloud, and so he contributed to the modeling of this event. Then, due to his interest for white dwarfs, he also worked on 1A supernovae, and especially on the merger scenario for this supernovae, which naturally leads to be interested in mergers in general. And Robert was among the first, following Bohdan Paczynski, to work on cosmological models of gamma ray burst, especially in the context of binary merger. And I checked the first paper of Robert on this scenario was published in 1983, well before the confirmation by afterglows of the cosmological origin of gamma ray burst, and well before the first association of a gamma ray burst and a binary merger. So Robert, please. So,
thank you, Frédéric, for the presentation. And first of all, I should explain why this is the second seminar on this object in less than 1 year, because the first one was given in last November by Samaya Nissanke. It was just 3 months after the event. Now we are 10 months, 300 days, 302 days exactly after the event. So Samaya gave a seminar in November, 3 months after the event, and she devoted most of her time on the gravitational wave detection and what we can learn from the gravitational wave data. And that time there were already electromagnetic counterparts, the gamma ray burst, beginning of the afterglow, the kilonova. But now, after 10 months, we have more data on these electromagnetic counterparts. And even if I will briefly comment the gravitational wave results, my seminar will be mainly focused on the electromagnetic result and the interpretation which have been proposed already. So, before going to this specific object, and since it is an historical event, I wanted to go back to the history of astrophysics of the last 50 years. And I have listed, it is my own perspective. Maybe you will find that some big results are missing here, but these are the most important highlights, I think. So for most of them, you can give a date. For the ultra-high energy cosmic ray and the development of numerical cosmology, it's an ongoing effort over the period. It's difficult to define a specific starting date. So as you can see in this list, many, if not most, of these results led to Nobel Prizes. And the ranking is difficult, but I think the burst of gravitational wave astronomy is close to the very top, if not at the very top. So what about the future? Next year, LIGO Virgo will resume operation, and we can expect new discoveries of mergers, black hole mergers, neutron-star merger, hopefully, and possibly a black hole plus neutron-star merger, which is something we have not seen yet. Probably there will be many other big things, but in this context, I mentioned LISA, 2034 or something, which will explore the gravitational wave radiation domain at lower frequency, finding different objects. And in 2000 something, I don't know when, you expect the next supernova in our Milky Way. I remind you that the last one observed with the naked eye was 1604. It might be that there were additional supernovae at a time where people were looking at the sky with very simple telescopes, so they were not able to, if it was not visible with the naked eye, practically there were no chance to detect the supernova. But the fact is that since 1604, the Kepler supernova, we have not seen any bright supernova in our galaxy. So hopefully the second digit will be 0, so that some of us will be able to see it. And personally, I would expect that the third digit is strictly smaller than 5 to give me, on a personal perspective, a chance to see it myself. So this is a summary of my talk. So I will try to tell you the story of two massive stars which will end producing two neutron stars, this neutron star coalescing, giving a gamma ray burst, a kilonova, etc. Then I will concentrate on the last 300 days, starting August 17, 2017, the moment when the gravitational wave signal was detected. I will mention what is going on right now and what will happen possibly in the coming days or coming months. And my conclusion will be putting things in perspective for next year and the future. So, the tale of two massive stars. So, yes, it was a long time ago in the galaxy far, not so far away, in fact, because the host galaxy has been identified. It's NGC 4993 at 40 megaparsec, which is 120 million light years, which is, on an astrophysical perspective, not so far away. It's quite far away, but not at the end of the universe. As you can see on this image, this galaxy, which is a spheroidal galaxy with very little star formation now, has a shell-like structure, and it could be that this is the result of merger which possibly took place 200 million years ago. And possibly also, as a result of this merger, there was a burst of star formation, an increase of star formation at that time in the galaxy, which led to the formation of a binary system of two massive stars. And I will take the example of a binary system of a 20 solar mass star with a companion, less massive companion of 8 solar masses. The initial separation is some little bit below 300 solar radii, and the period is typically 100 days. This is just an example of what is considered to be the main channel of formation at the end of a binary neutron star. There are, which is, I would say, the normal evolution of a binary system of massive stars. There are more exotic channels, which I will not describe. So, in the first episode, after a few million years, the first star fills its Roche lobe, and there is a first period of mass transfer from the most massive star to the less massive one. And this transfer is approximately conservative, which means that both total mass and total angular momentum is conserved in the system. So if you look at the expression of the total angular momentum, so the total mass is conserved, which means that the product of the two masses times the square root of the separation is conserved. So from this conservation, you can compute the final separation at the end of mass transfer when all the all the atmosphere of the originally more massive star has been transferred, so leaving its core, which become a Wolf-Rayet star, and the separation has increased by a factor 2.8, so now the new separation is nearly 800 solar radii in the period, nearly 500 days. In the second episode, the Wolf-Rayet star explodes as a type 1b supernova. It is a core collapse supernova, but no hydrogen in the envelope, so it's a type 1, type 1b or type 1c, depending on whether both the hydrogen and helium have been lost, this type 1c. If helium remains, it's a type 1b. So, the helium star, the Wolf-Rayet star, become a neutron star. So the new masses in the system are 1.4, the newly formed neutron star, and the companion 24. Since this companion is very massive, the resulting eccentricity after the explosion remains moderate, typically 0.1, and the orbit is rapidly circularized due to tidal dissipation in the massive component. So you end with a new separation, which is typically the previous one, type 1 plus the eccentricity, 10 separation, which is 10% larger. So now 850 solar radii and a period of nearly 600 days. The third episode corresponds to the moment where the original secondary, now more massive star, fills its Roche lobe. So, but this mass transfer cannot be conservative. Most of the mass and angular momentum is lost by the system. So again, you form what remains is the core of the massive star, but the orbit is very much, the radius of the orbit is very much reduced due to the loss of energy and angular momentum by the system. You can estimate the new separation by assuming that a small fraction, typically 10 to 20% of the gravitational energy is dissipated when the two stars become engulfed in the common envelope. And this is a huge reduction of the orbit because you, from nearly 1,000 solar radii, you end with just a few solar radii. So now you have a binary made of a neutron star and a Wolf-Rayet, a separation just a few solar radii and a period of a few hours. The episode 4 is the Wolf-Rayet star, which is now exploding as a supernova, type 1bc supernova, leaving two neutron stars. And at that stage, there is a very high risk for the system to be disrupted. In fact, with the example I have chosen, going from 1.4 to 5 to 1.4 plus 1.4, the system will be broken if the explosion is spherically symmetric. If the explosion is spherically symmetric, you expect, or you can demonstrate that the system is broken if the mass which is lost represents more than half of the total mass of the system, which is the case in the example which I have taken here. The total mass is 6.4. If you lose more than 3.2, you break the system. And this is, in this case, in the example I have taken, you lose 3.6. So if the explosion is spherically symmetric, you break the system. Now there is a possibility, and this is explained, in fact, the fact that many pulsars have high velocities. There are other reasons for that, but one of the possible reasons is that in this binary system, very often the system is broken and the neutron stars are ejected with, at large velocities. It can be that even if this condition for the system to be broken is satisfied, the system might not be broken if the explosion is not spherically symmetric. The nascent neutron star receives a kick, which can partially compensate in some way for the velocities and allow the system to remain bounded. And this can very often happen because there is no reason to believe that the explosion is perfectly symmetric. The typical velocities of this of the of the gas which is ejected is 10,000 kilometers per second. You eject several solar masses. The remnant is 1.4 solar mass. Even an asymmetry of a few percent is enough to produce a kick of several hundred kilometers per second, which can both, in some cases, increase the risk of breaking the system, but in some cases also allow the system to remain bounded. So now you have formed a system of two neutron stars, and if you assume that these two neutron stars are separated by less than 4 or 5 solar radii, then they may merge within Hubble time due to the loss of energy of an angular momentum from the emission of gravitational wave by the system. These are the two equations which control the evolution of the period and the eccentricity. And the applications shown here correspond to the binary Taylor pulsar, the binary pulsar 1913 plus 16. In fact, the calculation here was performed by three L3 students who are doing right now their internship at IAP. So you see, in this case, the merging time is typically 320 million years. And
formulas by Peters and Matthews.
Yes.
From the 60s.
Okay, so it's fair from you to tell that. Yeah. I thought that it was not the first time that this, but I took it from your reference. Okay. And it's also a way to say hello to you. So now the final evolution, the very last moment of the binary, the two neutron stars become very close to each other, and you see the signal which has been recorded by the two LIGOs, and nothing has been detected by the Virgo, but I will mention briefly that the fact that Virgo has seen nothing already still carries information which was very valuable to constrain the location of the source in the sky and to reduce the size of the error box. So this is called a chirp. In fact, for a long time, I didn't know what chirp meant. I was told that it is gazouillis, and and then I put the symbol for the tweet, and the question is, what is the difference between a chirp and a tweet? It seems that in French, one, cannot remember which one is gazouillis, and the other is pépiment. And I don't know which one is. So this is because, you have a signal which increases in intensity and in frequency. Whoop, so it's supposed to be reminiscent of a chirp. In the case of the two neutron stars, contrary to the two black holes, which were much more massive, a large number of cycles could be observed from in the bandwidth of the detector from approximately 30 to 1,000 hertz. The chirp mass, which is a combination of the two masses, is pretty well determined to be 1.2 solar mass. The masses of the two components is less well constrained, but it is in the interval of between 1.2 and 1.4 something. The viewing angle, which is the angle with the perpendicular of the orbit, is less than 28 degrees. The distance just from gravitational wave is 40 megaparsec, and I will go back to this briefly later. This finally led to the identification of the host galaxy, NGC 4993. After the coalescence, and this is the result of a 3D simulation by Rezola et al., it's not very obvious to see very much details, but there is a central object which is massive, 2.5 solar masses, and it's not clear whether it directly collapsed to a black hole. If it will collapse to a black hole on a certain time, which is not well fixed, but will end as a black hole, or if it can stay as a massive but long-lived neutron star, which can be very magnetized, and then it's called a magnetar. So at the center, we may have either a black hole or a massive neutron star. This central object is surrounded by an accretion torus of a few tenths of solar mass, typically 0.3, the accretion disk or accretion torus. And there is some mass which is lost, a small amount of mass which is lost by the system via what you see here, the tidal tails, which are called in the picture dynamical ejecta. And there is also a second way for the system to lose mass from a wind which is driven along the axis of the system. So you have both the mass which is lost on the side by the so-called tidal effects, and also some mass which is blown up by a wind along the axis of the system. So the seventh episode is kilonova. So the system loses a few 10 to the minus 2, 10 to the minus 1 solar mass. This is a bubble of gas, which is very neutron-rich. Very neutron-rich nuclei are formed, which are beta instable, very radioactive. So this bubble of gas is heated by radioactivity. It's evolved rapidly from, well, you have an animation, but it's not, which shows the evolution of the spectrum as a function of time, going rapidly from blue to red and to very red and the infrared over a period of a few days. And basically, you have the same picture on the right. In this case, you have a full spectrum. In this case, on the right, you have data in various filters. So you see, so both the intensity decreasing and the whole spectrum shifts towards the red and the infrared as the bubble of the kilonova expands. And now episode 8, the gamma ray burst. So as you can see, you have the chirp, and which marks the moment of the coalescence, and the data recorded by the Fermi and integral satellite showing a weak short gamma ray burst, which would have been possibly unnoticed or which wouldn't have driven so much interest. But in this case, it became maybe the most important gamma ray burst ever observed. Not, I don't know, but among the most important gamma ray bursts ever observed. We expect more in the future. So you see that there is a delay of 1.7 seconds between the gravitational wave signal, which marks the coalescence of the two stars, and on the gamma ray burst. It's indeed a gamma ray burst because it produces photons above 100 keV, several also above 200 keV. The initial part of the burst, in the initial part of the burst, the spectrum is non-thermal, and possibly it moves to a thermal spectrum at the end, but the statistic regarding the spectrum is not so good, so it's difficult to be absolutely sure that you have this evolution from non-thermal to thermal. But there are some indications that this is indeed the case. This burst is very underluminous by 4 to 5 orders of magnitude compared to regular GRBs that we observe at cosmological distances. So you see the luminosity, the total energy released in the form of gamma ray. Okay, I should define the so-called EISO. I mean, we know that the emission is beamed in a certain solid angle, so we can define the energy we receive per solid angle, and then we multiply by 4 pi to find the equivalent isotropic energy which is released, even if we know that the emission is not isotropic. So this burst is a strong outlier of the so-called Yonetoku or E-peak L-ISO correlation that you can find here. So you see many bursts. In fact, each burst is represented by several points because there are several spikes. So each spike in this diagram is considered as a burst by itself. So you see this correlation with E-peak. So I should explain E-peak. So if you represent the new F-nu spectrum, this spectrum goes to a maximum, which is a so-called peak energy, which is representative of the energy of the photons, which carry most of the energy of the event. So you see this correlation, which is called the Yoneto correlation, and the gamma ray burst is here. So it's an outlier, a very, very strong outlier of this relation. So clearly we are seeing something which is not common and which is very specific to this peculiar event. An event that we see because it is closed, and an event which we will be missed if it occurred at cosmological distances. And then the afterglow. So basically, the afterglow is the result of the interaction of the ejected material with the interstellar medium. This material is ejected at relativistic velocity. It drives a shock in the stellar medium. Behind the shock, electrons are accelerated. The magnetic field is amplified, and this electron radiates synchrotron photons. This is basic afterglow physics, which has been worked out already for standard gamma ray bursts long ago. You see here from the bottom to the top. At the bottom, it's the X-ray afterglow. In the middle, the optical, and the two upper curves are radio afterglows. You can see that basically these light curves are the same because they are, in fact, from the X-ray to the radio, we are in the same so-called radiative regime. You see this, this is the so-called injection frequency, nu I, which is the frequency of the original electron, and nu C is the cooling frequency. It's the frequency from electrons which cool on a time scale which cool by synchrotron radiation of a time scale which is comparable to the dynamical time scale of the system. And the fact that from X-ray to radio, the frequency is between these two frequencies means that we are in the same so-called spectral regime, and you see that the light curves are basically the same, which means that I would say you learn, it's very important to have this light curve, but you learn nothing going from one frequency to, in fact, you learn something. You learn the index of the electron distribution, because the index of the electron distribution gives the interval between the different light curves, but the shape is exactly the same. You can also remark that the optical light curve, which is the second one from the bottom, has only data point after 100 days, because this is the afterglow, and before 100 days, the afterglow was outshined by the kilonova, and it's only after the kilonova has declined that the afterglow could be observed. So now I concentrate on the last 300 days. So briefly going back to the gravitational wave data, you can see the error box, the original LIGO error box, the information from Virgo, which is not a detection, but which gives you an exclusion zone, which reduces the size of the error box, the Fermi error box for the gamma ray observation, which is very large. And then this initial error box, LIGO plus Virgo, was searched for galaxies at a distance of 40 megaparsec, and there were a few candidates, but among these candidates, there was this galaxy where the kilonova could be detected, and you see the images. It's a spheroidal galaxy, as I already mentioned, and you see the first telescope. It's a small telescope, SWOPE, which first identified the kilonova 10 hours, 11 hours after the event. So now we know the distance, and the viewing angle can be obtained with a better accuracy now that we know the exact location. From the optical data, we know the exact location. So this exact location plus the information from the gravitational waves gives you an estimate for the viewing angle, which is a little bit less than 30 degrees. Before the information on the exact location of the sky, the constraint on the viewing angle was much worse, something like less than 50 degrees or something. So the extraordinary good fortune for this first event was that this inclination was sufficiently small so that we witnessed the whole display, gravitational waves, the kilonova, the gamma ray burst, and the afterglow. Very possibly, for coming events with larger viewing angle, we will lose some of these observables. We don't know what was the fate of the central object, black hole or massive highly magnetized neutron star, the so-called magnetar. In fact, the probability to have observed an event with a viewing angle of less than 28 degrees is basically the product of simply the fraction of solid angle times the volume over which you can detect the event, and this volume depends on the viewing angle. And since the signal for a gravitational wave emission going towards you is somewhat larger than if you are on the side, this increases a little bit the probability. The pure solid angle 1 minus cosinus is 12%, and with considering the fact that this angle is small, then the fraction of events that you can detect with a viewing angle less than 28 degrees is about 20%, and for the other direction, from 30 to 60, and from 60 to 90, the probability would be approximately 40%, which means that we were, in a way, not extremely lucky, but somewhat lucky to have the first event with a sufficiently small viewing angle so that we could see all the display, all the firework. So now, going back to the kilonova with a little bit more details. So the kilonova is made of two components, a so-called red and a so-called blue kilonova. So this is a very simplified picture. So the two neutron stars, they merge, you form black hole, let's say black hole, and you have a dynamical ejecta on the sides, which are basically the tidal tails of the object which is formed during the coalescence, which are ejected by the system, and these are very neutron rich. And there is an additional component. It's a wind is blown up from the pole of the object, and this produces the so-called blue kilonova because you expect that this material will be less neutron rich. And in the material which is very neutron rich, the opacity is essentially controlled by the lanthanide class elements, and this opacity is very large, while when the lanthanide elements are in less abundant, then the opacity is reduced and the ejecta is more transparent. So the devil is in the details, so producing a very detailed kilonova is very complicated, but the basics of the physics are very simple. So you have a sort of energy equation, which on the left here, U is a sort of normalized quadratic time, and T0 is given by this expression, and where you see that appear the opacity of the material, the ejected mass, and the velocity of the material which is ejected, and the typical time scale is of the order of days. And the radioactive heating, L star, this is the mass of the system times a specific heating factor, and since it is radioactivity, you might expect decaying exponential, but since you have many, many elements which add up, the resulting evolution is more power law, and you have here the result of a detailed calculation taking into account the whole collection of nuclei which are formed when neutrons are ejected, and you see that this nuclear heating follows more a power law that maybe at the beginning it's closer to exponential decay because there is one very radioactive element which dominates, but after that, with all the contribution, you have more a power law than an exponential decay. So you can compute the Lie curve, the resulting Lie curve, and here is an example. I mean, these are data compared to a model, and this model is a combination of a blue and a red kilonova. So for the red component, you see a little bit more massive, slower, large opacity, the blue component less massive, faster, smaller opacity, and the typical time scale which I defined on the previous slide is for the red kilonova 6 to 7 days, and you see this corresponds to this slower evolution, which essentially is observed in the red and infrared, and the blue with this parameter, the time scale for the blue kilonova is just a few days. So you see the emission in the blue and ultraviolet is dominated by the blue kilonova with a decay time scale which is short. If you go to the infrared, then most of the emission, except at the very beginning, comes from the red component with a slower decay time scale. So now now episode 8, the gamma ray burst. So this is again the gamma ray burst. So the initial spike, it's not very clear here, but I mean the tail, which possibly is thermal. So how to explain this peculiar gamma ray burst? Could it be simply a normal GRB which is seen off axis? So you have the object, okay, central engine, accretion torus, a relativistic jet which is formed along the system axis. So and a cocoon, there is a loose definition of the cocoon. The cocoon is a sort of combination of the material ejected from the kilonova with the material which could be in addition, before or after, ejected by the central engine at more relativistic velocity. So this is a very schematic view of the cocoon. So, so what we see, the gamma ray burst, is it simply the emission from the central jet seen off axis? It is emission from the cocoon, but with assuming a typical scenario that we invoke to explain normal gamma ray burst, but simply with non-standard parameter. And for example, the non-standard parameter could be that the injected power is much lower, the Lorentz factor is much smaller, but could it be basically the same kind of mechanism, or should we invoke a more specific scenario, which I will describe, and which is a so-called shock breakout scenario? So, so this picture was prepared by Frédéric. So could it be simply a normal GRB seen off axis? If you, I mean, in gamma ray burst, the luminosity and the energy of the photon are shifted by Doppler factors. I will not give the expression of this Doppler factor, which depends on the Lorentz factor and the viewing angle. The cube for the luminosity, power 1 for the peak energy. So if you change the viewing angle so that the luminosity is decreased by 5 orders of magnitude, then you will decrease also the peak energy, and you go from a regular GRB to the so-called X-ray flash. You do not produce any more gamma ray photons. So this doesn't work. Another view, okay, you could impose that this object is indeed a GRB seen off axis. So you start here. There are several data points because there are several measurements, but basically what we see is here. So very low luminosity compared to regular GRB, but photon over 100 keV. And then if you suppose now you want to see how this burst would look like if seen on axis, you end with this point. So this would be a very, very peculiar event, not so luminous, but with a peak energy of several MeV. And here you have a few short GRBs which have been represented. Most are along this strip here. And you see that this object would be very, very peculiar and highly non-classical. It is not completely forbidden, but why would this first event that we see be so specific? So probably simply claiming that we are seeing a regular GRB off axis is not the good explanation. So I should go a little bit more rapidly, so because I will lack time at the end. So we also had a look to see if it could be one of the standard scenarios, but with peculiar parameter. So we tried internal shock model. The peak energy in the internal shock model depends on the injected power, on the contrast between the shell which collide. In the internal shock model, you have shell with different Lorentz factor. So you have a fast shell which is able to catch up with a slower one. They collide, energy is dissipated, and this energy is radiated via synchrotron radiation. So you can play with these parameters, and indeed you can, I will not comment very much here, you can produce bursts which have the good properties, which have very low luminosity, but still can produce gamma ray. This is a possibility. In this model, it might be difficult, if confirmed, to explain the transition from a non-thermal to a thermal spectrum. So there are other models for classical GRBs, the so-called reconnection model, where the ejecta is magnetized and the energy is dissipated via magnetic recollection, and the so-called photospheric model, which I will not describe. And you can work out if, by changing the parameter, you can explain the bursts that we have seen. This is done, for example, in this paper. This is in principle possible. It would be very important, but very difficult to know or to confirm if the spectrum indeed evolved from non-thermal to thermal. Then there is a more specific model, which is a so-called shock breakout mechanism. So everything is explained here. So you have the central engine. This central engine, by some mechanism which are not specified, produce a relativistic ejecta, which is launched through the cocoon, which breaks out at the cocoon surface with a Lorentz factor of a few. And the energy which is stored behind the shock is can suddenly escape when the shock emerges at the cocoon surface. You would expect, in this case, to have a thermal spectrum, but initially the time scale for thermalization is too long compared to the dynamical time scale. So in this sort of model, you could possibly explain the transition from non-thermal to thermal. So I will show you rapidly. So this is a model where you have the cocoon. The scale is changing to adapt to the size of the object is expanding. And this is the case where the jet is able to propagate through the cocoon and to break out the cocoon. But there are other models where, in fact, the jet, if I can, the jet remains trapped. Okay, I will skip this. The jet could also remain trapped inside the cocoon. Still, it injects energy inside the cocoon, drive a shock. Energy is produced when this shock breaks out at the surface, but the jet itself is not able to propagate all the way through the cocoon and possibly to produce a bright GRB on axis. So this would be a failed GRB, but still a cocoon emission from the energy which is dissipated inside the cocoon. So maybe I will not, we can try different ways to decide between these different scenarios, but I just draw your attention on the first sentence. These hints are not fully conclusive. Maybe, possibly, they would possibly exclude reconnection model, but it's not clear, so I will not comment. It's not obvious to find a good criterion to decide between models. The one which is proposed here is to consider the delay between the gravitational wave signal and the time we observe the gamma ray burst, which is something like a little bit more than 1 second, because in fact, if you imagine that the gravitational wave signal is produced, I would say, immediately, and the jet is launched immediately after the merging, then there is a phase where this jet moves very rapidly, but not at the velocity of light, to a certain radius, and then produce the gamma, which go to the observer at the velocity of light. So there is a short part of the travel which is made at c minus epsilon. So this adds some delay compared to the gravitational wave, and you can use this kind of information to decide between models, but this is not really conclusive, fully conclusive. So now the afterglow. We are still observing the afterglow. the last data point are right now, and it's declining. It went through the maximum, and we discussed the possibility to explain the gamma ray burst that we are seeing the jet off axis, but for the afterglow, people also tried this possibility. Initially, if you are off axis, as the ejecta is moving at very large Lorentz factor, the radiation is beamed over 1/gamma, and you see nothing. And as the Lorentz factor decreasing, the relativistic beaming becomes less important. Gamma decreasing, 1/gamma increasing, and suddenly you start seeing something. So it could be something like that. It could also be a combination of emission from the whole cocoon, or it could be still the cocoon emission, but dominated by the part of the cocoon which is essentially looking towards you. So I'll show you a few calculations for these different possibilities. So the jet seen off axis doesn't work. This is an example where you try to fit the last part of the afterglow light curve. So you see a viewing angle 25 degrees, jet opening angle 10 degrees, values of the energy, of the density of the external medium, redistribution parameter for the energy. I will comment on that before. So you see that indeed you see nothing at the beginning, and you start seeing things when 1/gamma is sufficiently large so that radiation can propagate towards you, but the rise at that moment is very steep and doesn't fit the afterglow. So this is a result from Lazzati, the Lazzati group, showing now a model where what we see is a sum of contribution from the whole cocoon. So you see the picture, the structure of the ejecta, and then the light curve, the radio light curve at 3 gigahertz. You see the data point, and you see the contribution of the different emission zones. So first you see the C light curve corresponding to the C, which corresponds to material going towards you. So you see this contribution first. And as the angle with the observer is increasing, going to A, which is energy which is released along the system axis, there is a delay. But if the energy increases as you reduce the angle relative to the system axis, you can have contribution which add up to produce the overall light curve. And this is an example, but it means that you need more and more energy as the viewing angle with the emission which contribute increasing, because, when this angle becomes important, the emission you get is reduced because you have less Doppler boost for this radiation. So, for this model to work, you have, and this is the figure which is shown below, as the angle from the jet axis decreases, you have to put more and more energy for this part of the ejecta to contribute. So, and now, assuming that you have the cocoon emission, and basically, still the cocoon, but only emission from material along the line of sign contribute. And this is an example with a single Lorentz factor for the bubble, which is coming, a single Lorentz factor which is evolving, but a single original value. This doesn't work either. But then there is a possibility to have something which works if you assume that the ejecta which comes toward you is a collection of different Lorentz factors, a front Lorentz factor which is the largest one, followed by slower Lorentz factor, a tail with slower value of the Lorentz factor. So as the ejecta propagate, then the front shells are decelerated, which allows the following one to catch up. So you have a series of collisions, basically a reverse shock, which adds energy to the shock wave and which allows to produce a light curve which fits the data very well. In fact, the problem here is that the solutions are degenerate. You have, in fact, many good solutions. You see, these are examples of solutions with the energy varying by 1 order of magnitude, and they are all able, if you adjust the external density, which is always very low, which is nice because we expect that in this spheroidal galaxies, the density of the external medium is low, so you have constraints on the Lorentz factor, etc., but you have many possible models which can fit the data. In fact, if we had data point at early times, which we don't have because the afterglow was too weak, we might be able to lift the degeneracy between the solution, but the first data in radio was typically at 20 days after the event. So now, and this is a hot topic because, as you may know, we had first information on polarization, which appeared at the beginning of this week. This is an AstroPH which appeared on Monday. There is people have tried to look for polarization, and these are work of Gill and Granot showing as a function of time the polarization. So the blue and red line are cocoon model. So you have a full line, dashed line, and dotted line. The full line assumes that your magnetic field is within the shock surface, and then in this case, and this is the situation which is normally preferred. And then you see that you expect quite a large polarization at late time. You see the dotted vertical line shows the time of the peak of the light curve, and the maximum polarization takes place a few days after that. And in this possibly ideal situation where the magnetic field is in the plane of the shock, you might expect a polarization reaching 50%. And for different possibly for the geometry of the magnetic field, the dashed and dotted line, you can get a polarization which is smaller. But you see the arrow now show the upper limit, which has been just published for the magnetization, which there are assumptions, but I mean, which basically I would say exclude cocoon model. I mean, cocoon model meaning cocoon where all the cocoon contribute to the light curve. And we are now expecting VLBI data. It seems that in this room, a few people already know the result from VLBI. It's not my case. I tried to convince them to tell me those results. I tried in many different possible ways, but right now I did not succeed. So I cannot tell you what those results are and what they have seen, and I don't even know when the result will be published. But these, you see the difference between a quasi-spherical cocoon and a situation where what I mean by quasi-spherical cocoon is a cocoon where the emissions that we see is dominated by emission of material along our line of sight. A Gaussian cocoon on the right is a situation where the whole cocoon has a contribution which is non-negligible over all this volume of surface, if you like. So already from the polarization, we have an indication that we might be in the quasi-spherical case, but it would be good to have also the information from VLBI. So in the last 5 minutes, I will try to tell you what we have been doing recently. There is a question, and we don't know the answer. Was there a normal GRB, or was there a relativistic jet, relativistic outflow, a beam relativistic outflow along the system axis? So can we obtain this answer from the afterglow? So it could be that there is no relativistic jet along the axis. The jet was choked, so there was no bright GRB along the system axis, and there is no contribution to observe. Now the central jet could be successful, but its contribution to the visible afterglow then depends on different parameters. The energy in this jet, its opening angle, which are intrinsic parameters for the jet. It could be environment parameters, the external medium density, and the so-called redistribution parameter epsilon E and epsilon B. I mean, when these jets interact with the external medium, they drive shocks, and the energy is dissipated behind the shocks, and this epsilon and epsilon b parameter tells you which fraction of the dissipated energy is used to accelerate electrons and which other fraction, epsilon b, is used to amplify the magnetic field. So these are so-called the redistribution parameter, and obviously there is also the viewing angle. So in fact, there are many different situations, and I show you the result of a few computations. The black line shows the actual light curve with the observed data point, and the fit of this observation, assuming a quasi-spherical cocoon. And then the blue line are different jet contribution for a viewing angle of 25 degrees, and increasing value from the right to the left. Maybe the indication is a little bit misleading. The high density is on the left. So, I mean, you see that if this jet energy remains moderate, 10 to the 51 erg, it's easy, I would say, to hide a jet below the cocoon afterglow. If the energy of the set is larger, it's become much more difficult to hide this jet, and you may possibly even predict, if you believe in such model, that we might witness a rebrightening of the afterglow in some days, weeks, or possibly months, and there are predictions like that, that if we are in this situation, or if the parameters are somewhat different, it could very well be that also in this case, we are below the cocoon afterglow and we will see nothing. But it might be that we observe the rebrightening of the afterglow in radio in the coming weeks. So, and this is nearly my last slide. This, in fact, carry basically the same kind of information. On the left, you have a moderately energetic jet, a viewing angle of 25 degrees, and in this table, you have the external density, which is low, between 10 to the minus 2 to 10 to the minus 5, and this epsilon b parameter, which basically indicates the strength of the magnetic field behind the shocks, and the red dots gives you the values of the parameter space, where you can possibly hide the central jet. So you see that it is relatively easy if this jet is not very energetic, and it becomes much more difficult, implying external density of 10 to the minus 4 below, if the jet is, which is natural, if the jet is more energetic, and even more, these black dots show parameter value for which you would predict a rebrightening in the future. So if you don't see the rebrightening in the future, this would exclude also these black dots, leaving a very limited space free for the parameter if the energy of the central jet is large. So the conclusion is it might be, there was maybe a central jet, but very possibly it was quite weak, because a bright central jet would possibly already have been observed. And this is the polarization, and in fact, the hint of the presence of the central jet can also be, not only with the light curve, can also be revealed by polarization. And this is an example of, you have the contribution in blue of the central jet, the isotropic afterglow in red, and now the sum of the two in black. You see that there is a very small contribution to the light curve from this, for this parameter to the overall light curve. But now if you compute the polarization, you see for this specific case that the predicted polarization is already above the limit which has been published just this week. For example, this case would be, with those parameters, would be excluded. So for those parameters of the external density viewing angle, I mean, probably if there is a central jet, its energy should be smaller than 5×10 to the 51 ergs. And now I conclude. So this was extraordinary times, but now we are excited and we want more. And we will have more at the beginning of next year when LIGO Virgo resume operation. So already for this one, Susanna, we are waiting for VLBI data coming soon. There is a question of a possible rebrightening of the light curve at later time. My bet is that there will be no rebrightening, but who knows? And for what can we expect from future events? I mean, we don't know the rate, but I mean, from what we have already seen, it's very encouraging, and we can expect many more events for binary black holes, which are interesting for general relativity, but not so much for regular astrophysics, I mean, which is dealing with electromagnetic radiation. So from future events, if we have many, we will explore the intrinsic versus viewing angle diversity, because there obviously might be an intrinsic diversity, mass of the component, or a black hole plus neutron star binary, but there is also simply a viewing angle diversity. The same event viewed over different viewing angle can look very different, in fact. Among the questions, we don't know the fate of the central jet. What are the conditions to have a black hole versus a surviving massive neutron star? We don't know also, we can try to explore the condition which gives you a successful or an unsuccessful central jet, which means either a bright GRB on axis or a failed GRB on axis. So the same event for the internal parameter can look very different depending on the density of the external minimum, which in a way reveals the event to the world, to the external world. Okay, I did not discuss many other important issues regarding those events, which are the measure of the a new way to measure the Hubble constants. We right now with one event we don't have something very accurate, but with many. Possibly, this will be a very competitive new way to estimate the Hubble constant. So there are many possible tests of gravitation, of fundamental physics, which can be explored with those events. And this was discussed by Samaya in her talk last November. In fact, I would like to insist that we were especially lucky for this first event to have what I call the full display, gravitational wave, kilonova, gamma ray burst, and afterglow. And depending for future events on the distance or the viewing angle, we will lose, okay, we will still have the gravitational wave because this is the original signal. The kilonova will resist possibly more because it is basically isotropic, but with a different, larger viewing angle, we will lose the GRB and possibly also the afterglow. So, okay, that's all. This is the conclusion. Now that's all.
Thank you very much, Robert. Questions? Jean-Pierre?
Robert, in your excellent talk, thank you very much, you didn't mention one weakness of the model is that the famous central jet is just put by hand, by fiat. It's not, there's no mechanism of producing the jet. That's why you said either a magnetar or a black hole. No, it's unbelievable that both will produce the same jet.
Yes, but I mean, in this specific object, people were not specifically interested in the way to produce central jet. You are right, they put it by hand when they are considering it. But on GRB in general, people have tried to work out different ways to produce the central jet. Okay, it could be magnetic energy extracted from the black hole by the Blandford-Snellius mechanics. Okay, there are many papers. Possibly the fact that we have so many papers means that we don't fully understand the way energy is extracted. Okay, there are proposals.
Can you say something about what would like neutron star black hole merger? Is it something in between two black holes merging?
This is a good question. I didn't think so much about it. Okay, but it's not relevant for the. Okay, the dynamics will be affected. For example, the mass of the kilonova. If there is any kilonova, I mean the kilonova is a few percent of material which is ejected from the system. The dynamic of the coalescence with two neutron stars or a neutron star plus black hole will be different. So, for example, the mass of the kilonova might be either larger or smaller. I don't know, in fact. There is another question. I mean, you see that in this case, we don't know for sure what the central object is. Is it a black hole? Is it a massive? I mean, if it is a black hole plus neutron star, we know for sure that the central object is a black hole, which could be interesting in terms of producing models for the object. But and the problem is that we don't know the rates. So there is, but this is probably very naive, the idea that if the mass difference, I mean the difference of mass becomes very large, the mass ratio becomes very dissymmetric, maybe the fraction of system decreases. I mean, typically people predict the merger rate for black hole plus neutron star smaller than for neutron star plus neutron star by a factor of from a few to 10. But this is very uncertain. We'll see, in fact. We'll explore this.
Thanks, Robert. It's a very interesting talk for people that are not experts of the topic. I have a question about nucleosynthesis that results from this. Perhaps it's not specifically a question for you, but perhaps from Nikos. But is there a hope that there's different nucleosynthesis products depending on how the merger takes place, and that could be tested by nuclear gamma ray lines, for instance? I
mean, I would say that you are, your question is already a second step, because the first discovery or confirmation, I don't know how to tell, is that very probably this kind of event are responsible for the production of the very neutron-rich, the so-called air process elements. It was believed that they were produced in supernova explosion. Now, I don't know if it is a consensus, but people believe that the situation where you release a few percent of solar mass of initially pure neutrons, which will reorganize themselves in very neutron-rich atoms, elements, nuclei, these are the main providers of air process element. And now, I mean, from event to event, for example, again, the difference between two neutron star and neutron star plus black hole, I don't know. And possibly the amount of mass you release depends on the dynamic of the coalescence. And then I don't know, again, I mean, it could possibly depend on the respective rotation of the two neutron stars. Are they rotating, how the rotation axes are oriented? I mean, probably the same, because at the very end, the tidal effect will probably regularize everything. But I mean, depending on the relative velocity of the two stars, rotation velocity of the two stars when they merge, you may eject more or less material. But I don't know. People are looking at this. In fact, what is remarkable here, in fact, this is the first kilonova we really observed. There were, in a few previous GRB, early afterglow, the power law decay, which is typical afterglow behavior, and in some cases there was one data point over this predicted power law decay, which was considered to be the indication of the presence of kilonova. There is the best case before this one was GRB 1308, I do not remember, and where there is just one data point in the infrared which has been attributed to the kilonova. And here we have a light curve spectra, and we will have more, hopefully, in the coming months or years. And then we will learn more. But you have to realize that basically this is kilonova were predicted long ago, in fact, by Paczynski. There is a paper by Paczynski and Lee during the 80s. But I mean, this basically is the first kilonova ever observed.
What is the relative scale of the afterglow with respect to the kilonova?
Oh.
It evolves in time, but what is the relative size, the scale?
I mean, the kilonova, I mean, it depends. Okay, it depends on the timing at the origin. I mean, could it be that you have first the ejected material which will produce a kilonova, and then after a short delay, the central engine is able to produce a more rapid, mildly relativistic ejecta, will catch up with material from the kilonova, or could it be that this relativistic ejecta is launched first, and then the kilonova material trails behind? I mean, but in any case, you expect that if the kilonova is launched first, the relativistic ejecta will catch up and possibly go forwards, and then, the velocity, the Lorentz factor will decrease due to the deceleration by the external medium.
In the cocoon model, with a shock breakout mechanism where the jet tries to drill a hole in the cocoon before escaping and producing the gamma rays, is it possible within this model to explain the delay between the gamma ray and the gravitational wave, the 2-second delay, entirely with this model?
Okay, it says, no, it depends on what you call the cocoon model. I mean, basically, the basic idea is that you have gravitational waves. They move, hopefully, at the velocity of light. You tell me. We assume that. And if there is any difference, it is probably very small. And then there is what we will observe as the gamma ray burst. Gamma ray bursts are photons. So there is, if you assume that the central source you have the merger, gravitational waves, and then it takes some time for the central source to generate a relativistic ejecta, short time, and then the relativistic ejecta begins to propagate until the time it releases its photon. So the delay between, this is a general picture, the delay between the gamma ray burst and the gravitational wave is the sum of the time it takes for the relativistic ejecta or outflow to develop, times the delay which is accumulated during the propagation to the point where the energy is released. So it's the sum of the two. So I do not remember exactly what your question was, but I mean this is a general picture. I mean, but you see in the cocoon model, but I mean the cocoon model has different. I
think that Luc was referring to the shock breakout.
And
in this case, you need a delay between the merger and the relativistic.
Yes, I mean for the shock breakout mechanism, you need some delay. You can put constraint, not very certain, but you probably cannot allow to have the relativistic ejecta produced immediately after the merger. You need some delay, possibly for the system to reorganize itself and launch the jet. And in some model, like the internal shock model, there is something nice, and we will see in future event, if we have always the same kind of feature, that the duration of the burst is very similar to the delay between the gravitational wave and the big start of the gamma ray burst, and this is natural in, for example, in internal shock models, while in other models this has to be in some way put by hand. So if it turns out to be a generic feature, maybe it would reinforce model of the kind of the internal shock model. But this is very early to draw any definite conclusion right now. We have to wait.
Okay, then Robert, thank you again.